Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a discussion about the future of the voice network for telcos in a world where Microsoft seems to have given up on Metaswitch. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Andrew Ward. I'm the CEO of Award Consulting, and I am joined today by Bob Barklay, who has actually recently joined us at Award Consulting to lead our sales efforts. Bob is one of 6 people that we've hired this year. It's been quite a big year for our growth. But actually, Bob and I, don't just have a 1 month or 2 month history. We've been working together originally back in, I think, 2006, when I was managing the support organization for Metaswitch, looking after customers in the Great Lakes region, and Bob was looking after that same territory on the sales side. So yeah, although it's a new time for us to be working together now, we've actually got a history that goes way back, and I'm delighted that we're able to reunite together at Award Consulting. So welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Andrew. It's very nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation and visiting with a bunch of Metaswitch customers. So adding on to what you said, I spent 18 plus years with Metaswitch, a part of the regional carrier group, which supported pretty much everybody on this call. Prior to Metaswitch, I cut my teeth in the operator space with a cable operator and an ISP, helping them launch services, voice services. And the reason I say that is because I appreciate how hard it is with the work that we all do today. So yeah, just happy to be here.
Wonderful. Cool. Thanks, Bob. So for everyone's sake, we've got a few slides here. You can see kind of the agenda we've got laid out. We're going to keep the slides pretty light. Mostly, I want this to be a fairly casual conversation between me and Bob. We do want this to be interactive, so we definitely like you to ask questions. Feel free to use the Q&A function within Zoom to ask those. We will take them at the end. We're not going to kind of stop midway through and do the questions. We'll try to do them all at the end. But feel free to put those into the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to those. Okay, so the big question to start is, what's happening with Metaswitch and Microsoft? And the primary purpose of this is obviously about the future, but I actually do want to just recap briefly kind of how we got here, because I think that's important as we make decisions about the future, is to look at the past. And for those of you who attended our webinar back in June, July, you'll see that I'm continuing with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy theme as best I can, with not all Hitchhiker's quotes, but with some Hitchhiker's quotes throughout the slides. Okay, so just to recap, I think probably most of you know, Metaswitch was an independent company for many years, originally founded in 1981. And, during the time that I worked there for 14 years, it was an independent, privately held company. But really, and that's the period during which it grew its North American customer base. But really, kind of for our purposes, the story begins in 2020 when Microsoft purchased Metaswitch and, made it part of the Azure for Operators group. And, Bob, you were on the inside at that time. I'd be curious to know, from your perspective, what was Microsoft's vision for Metaswitch, and why did they make that acquisition?
Well, at the time, it was pretty exciting. Being a part of Microsoft, and the hope is that Microsoft was going to meet the Metaswitch customers where they were in their journey to the cloud, and it all kind of seemed to make sense to us. There was a huge emphasis on leveraging Azure network function virtualization for any customer, inside or outside of telecom, with an emphasis on 5G, edge compute, and private wireless networking. Complex stuff. Metaswitch had a history of doing difficult things well, and Affirm Networks had a good mobile core, so it seemed to be good. For the regional team and the customers on this call, we were hopeful that would include some elements and integrations with Teams, right? Thereby giving us some competitive advantage. But sadly, that just became a non-starter. In fact, there was very little in the form of software development for our carrier customers, and a lot of time was spent on the security compliance because that was hefty work. From a Microsoft point of view, it was all about scale. and moving the needle with Azure Compute. We had a nice proof point with AT&T voicemail, but we were hard pressed to manufacture a business outlook that used a lot of Azure Compute. And unfortunately, the regional customer base, we had like 550 customers, did not represent enough workload to invest, because there needed to be some development done to cloudify the CFS and the EAS, and Perimeter being the exception, because that aided with Teams and direct routing. So, but just not enough critical mass, I guess, to justify that workload. From your point of view, Eric and Andrew, outside of from being outside the company, what was your impression on how things were going?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when the announcement first came out, I had some optimism. I mean, like you said, you kind of look at Teams plus CFS and you think if you could integrate these two tightly together, then, if the Metaswitch service providers had a more compelling, offering with UCaaS plus Teams all integrated well, wouldn't that be cool? So I think there were hopes about how that might happen. My impression is that the Teams integration that did happen was all driven by the Metaswitch side, and that the Teams people, didn't really know that the Metaswitch people existed, unfortunately. So it seems like that was never a strategic part of the acquisition. The original announcement had mentioned 5G and VoLTE and this kind of thing as the drivers for the announcement, and I hoped that that wasn't entirely true, but with time it kind of became clear that really, that was what it was about. And so, yeah, there was very little roadmap. I kept looking to Metaswitch saying, tell me your vision. What is your vision for the regional carriers? Why should we be sticking with you? What does the future hold? And unfortunately, we never really got much beyond, some security improvements and maybe one day putting things in Azure. Although even that, if it had come to fruition, it wasn't clear how much that would benefit the actual service providers. So yeah, it was, I think there were some hopes in the early days, but yeah, things didn't quite turn out in the way that we'd hoped, and things were kind of in a fairly static period for several years there.
Well, and then 2024 hits, and it was very interesting, because a lot of emotions, because a lot of people had a lot of time with Metaswitch, and things went off the rails a bit. Yes.
Yeah, 2024, things went off the rails in a couple of different phases. In April, there was an announcement that MaxUC, the soft client, was going to be end of lifed, with a date in April 2026 as the last date of support for that client. And the general message was, well, hey, everyone, you should focus on Teams, and service providers, forget about selling your hosted seats. Instead, you should just become a Teams reseller, and that's a great opportunity for you. And I think that was a message that didn't really fit. I sat on a couple of webinars where Microsoft made that case, but the revenue that you get as a service provider from reselling Teams is obviously substantially less than from owning the phone line and providing that service. So I was never convinced by that for the majority of our client base. But yeah, I mean, yeah, MaxUC kind of, they announced that it was going away, and there was some, I think probably MaxUC was just too competitive with Teams, or maybe it just wasn't worth making any investment in it, given the complexities of supporting an end user, desktop client and mobile client, compared to the core network. But I don't think, I didn't immediately think this means everything's over. I thought this was kind of a one-off situation, rather than a kind of, overall the whole product is dead.
Well, thank you. I mean, I know how we all viewed it while we were all at Metaswitch at the time, and Microsoft at that point. And we know how it affected us. With your customers at that time, how did they respond to the news?
For those, many of our customers are doing largely residential class 5 services, and so it wasn't that big a deal for them. But for those who had invested heavily in, Metaswitch UCaaS, there was a lot of anger about this, really a feeling that, they've been really damaged by Microsoft. People are often selling multi-year contracts to their customers, and now they couldn't actually supply the product for the duration of the contract. So there was a lot of anger and uncertainty about what to do. We actually had a group of clients, basically sponsor us as an organization to do the research to figure out what alternative clients there were out there. And so we spent several months, testing clients and, doing some integration work to kind of see what might work as a replacement. And yeah, that was a lot of work, but I think it was worthwhile to give people options for what the future might hold.
Very good. Above and beyond, really. So, what was the result of that work?
Yeah, so we ended up writing a report, which is available for purchase if anyone wants. You can drop me an email. But the short answer is that we identified Acrobat's Cloud Soft Phone and Counterpath's Bria clients as viable alternatives to Max UC. Obviously, neither of them is identical to Max UC. The integrations aren't quite so tight, but they're both good products, which could work for people as an alternative. So we figured those were the best options, and we've made introductions to the relevant salespeople at both those companies for a variety of our clients. And if anyone on this call would like an introduction, we'll have a poll later where you can kind of ask for that, and we would be happy to make that introduction for you.
So that was the first part of 2024, but the news didn't stop there. Then came the layoffs. Where were you, and how did you find out about it?
Yeah, well, it was a Monday morning, and I, got up and started work. And the first shoe to drop was I got an email from, one guy in the UK saying, "Hey, I've just been laid off. Could we potentially do some work together?" And I thought, oh, Metaswitch, Microsoft is doing another round of layoffs. They do them about once a year. They lay off a few people. Okay, and I was like, sure, I'll chat to you absolutely. But then over the course of the next few hours, once it became daytime in the US, I got more and more calls, and it quickly became apparent, through those calls, but also through people posting on LinkedIn and, other announcements in the press or people speculating in the press, that there were very, very heavy layoffs going on. And so, it seemed like pretty much nearly all the sales team had been laid off. Large chunks of the professional services, large chunks of the development team, creating the product, even some of the support, although much less in that organization. But yeah, the cuts were very, very heavy. And it was, it was really sad. I think, as somebody who my first job was at Metaswitch and I worked there for 14 years, this was kind of like the end of that culture, of that organization, of all of these people who I'd worked with for so long. There was a lot of grief, from me and from all the people affected. And it was a pretty tough time. And the Microsoft didn't quickly tell us why this was all happening. But it eventually became apparent that they basically decided that the acquisition of Metaswitch hadn't worked out. They hadn't had the growth that they'd wanted, and so they were deciding to focus on AI and Teams and the things that were having lots of success, and that they were just kind of saying, okay, this didn't work. We're gonna move on and not invest in this anymore. And so they eventually said, there won't be any new sales to new customers. I think existing customers could still buy, expansions to their product, but there were no new sales. And they talked about end of support, some years out, probably 5+ years out from here, are the kinds of dates they've talked about, but they haven't actually given concrete dates. So that's kind of where we find ourselves now in terms of things we actually know.
Yeah, great. For those of us on LinkedIn, it's been kind of bittersweet because you have all these folks that are talking about their experience and time with Metaswitch, but it's bringing a lot of people together. People are finding new roles in different companies. So, one of the positives is just seeing how close everybody was and how much they are trying to help each other. Are you expecting any more detailed news?
I think, well, ever since this happened, as I was kind of understanding the strategy here and talking to people about it, it felt like if Microsoft was making the decision that they wanted to move on and focus on, AI and Teams and that kind of thing, then keeping Metaswitch kind of alive on life support was really going to be a distraction for them. So my theory from the beginning was they would try to sell it to somebody. That's the clearest way to never have to think about it again, right? So if that's your logic, then that would make sense. So yeah, we've heard rumors about that. I think they probably will do that. I imagine at some point we'll get some kind of announcement, but there hasn't been anything come out yet. Regardless of that, even if it is sold, I think the technology is going to be sold. Presumably, whatever people are, the people who are left would still be part of that. But there's so many people gone that I think the culture that was Metaswitch, the organization that was Metaswitch, has yeah, effectively gone at this point, sadly.
Any suitors come to mind?
Nice try. I've heard lots of rumors with a variety of names given, but I'm not going to mention those on this call. I think what we can do is think about what kind of organization might acquire the assets. And I think, maybe there were hopes in the early days that a kind of white knight organization might come along who loved the product and would, buy it and then invest in it and kind of restart Metaswitch of old. I think probably that's, a bit optimistic. I think more
Wishful thinking.
likely, yeah, more likely, I think it would be somebody who has their own voice product, and they are more acquiring the Metaswitch customers, and they would presumably come in and support the customer base on the Metaswitch for a shortish period of time while encouraging those people to move onto whatever platform they have. So it's more about, my guess is it's more about acquiring the customer base than it would be about acquiring and maintaining and building the product.
Were you thinking about reaching into the checkbook and buying them?
Yeah, I mean, I had my kids look down the back of the sofa cushions to see what kind of money I could, find. They found a quarter, which I'm not sure was quite enough. No, more seriously, we actually did have conversations about this. We had some conversations with investors. Yeah, ultimately we decided that it didn't really fit with who we are and what we want to do. I mean, our North Star is to be providing technical services for service providers, for our client base, and you know, any attempt to kind of acquire the Metaswitch assets would be a huge distraction from that. And, becoming a vendor rather than a services organization kind of, changes who we are in a significant way. And so really we felt like we could serve our clients better by focusing on what we're doing, and not going on some crazy other path that would, require a lot of change and, disruption to what we were doing.
You know, having been around a while, there's another way to maybe look at it. When you look at a product life cycle, right? There's four stages of a product life cycle. There's the introduction, the growth, and the maturity, and the decline. I think with the June layoffs, the Metaswitch has officially entered the decline stage. Now, this change only validates our business model as independent Metaswitch experts. If our North Star is to serve our clients and act in their benefit, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to become the switch vendor. We want to be flexible to serve whatever path our customers take. For some, it will be to enjoy the ride in the decline stage and extend the value of the Metaswitch for many years to come. For those who need to migrate to another platform because of their circumstances, that can be a very challenging process. And we want to be there for them to assist in that process.
Yep, I fully agree. I think I'm very comfortable with the decisions we've made, and we'll have to see what happens in the coming months in terms of who an acquirer would be and what they want to do with it.
Well, we're doing pretty good so far, Andrew.
We're doing okay. We'll try to keep this within the time limit. Go ahead.
All right. So I guess that brings us to the big question. If someone is using Metaswitch for Class 5 switching today, what options do they have?
Yeah, I want to talk about that. But actually, before I do, I want to share a little funny story about this slide. So to get nice quotes for the slides, I've been using ChatGPT. So I asked it, I said, can you give me a quote, kind of on this topic, from somebody famous that would be appropriate? And so it gave me this quote: "The only time you should ever change horses midstream is if the horse you're on is about to drown." And I thought that's a really good quote. That's very applicable to what I'm talking about. And it said it was Tennessee Williams. So then I searched the internet for this quote and discovered that it didn't exist. Like, it was entirely made up by ChatGPT. And I was like, oh, darn, that's a really good quote. So I decided to just use it anyway because it's good enough that somebody should have said it. So we're sticking with this quote, even though it was entirely made up by ChatGPT. But yeah, like I said, Microsoft's investing in AI. They think that's the future. Let's hope they're successful and that things keep getting better. Because I do love my ChatGPT.
I think you'll get away with that one, but the ones that are following this one, I'm not too sure you're going to get to it.
Bob's seen the next slides. We'll see how those pan out. All right. Anyway, your question is.
Go to the question, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, Class 5 switching options. Now, I think, to get nice quotes for the slides, I've been using ChatGPT. So I asked it, I said, can you give me a quote, kind of on this topic, from somebody famous that would be appropriate? And so it gave me this quote: "The only time you should ever change horses midstream is if the horse you're on is about to drown." And I thought that's a really good quote. So I decided to just use it anyway because it's good enough that somebody should have said it. So we're sticking with this quote, even though it was entirely made up by ChatGPT. But yeah, like I said, Most service providers are offering a variety of different services on their switch, and for this particular slide, I want to focus on class 5. So I'm talking about residential lines, TDM interconnections, SS7, regulatory compliance, TCAP, LMP, toll-free services, that kind of thing. And we've obviously had a lot of discussions with people about what they might do in this scenario. I think when when the announcements came out about the layoffs in the summer, my assumption was, well, everyone's going to have to move to something else. And we started kind of looking around at options and, trying to figure out a plan, assuming that with this metaphor, the horse was about to drown. But once we started looking at the options and, focusing on this kind of class 5 core functionality, there isn't really many people who are focused on that part of the functionality. We'll get on to talking about, cloud-based UCaaS platforms in a couple of slides. But in terms of, a kind of like-for-like replacement for the Metaswitch, the closest thing really is, the products from Ribbon, C15, C20, that kind of thing. And, as you may know, Metaswitch and Ribbon have a fairly long history. And, personally, I haven't done much work with Ribbon, but yeah, I think that's really the only kind of direct option as a replacement.
So just jumping in a little bit here from being on that sales team, when operators make decisions, there's three basic value drivers when they're going to make that decision, and it's, will they make money, make more money? For example, new revenue generating services. Will they save money? It's another one. Lower cost of operations and infrastructure. And then thirdly is will they mitigate risk of obsolescence? And that's what a lot of us here on this call are thinking about. Now, when I think back again to the days where it was Ribbon and Metaswitch kind of going head to head, or Genband or Nortel, we had been competitors for a long time, and sometimes, quite acrimoniously. My opinion has always been that the Metaswitch product line was better. Given our history with protocols, we had a tightly integrated suite of products with both VoIP and TDM given equal weight, backed up by a really strong engineering team. The sales pitch was backed up, and we could deliver on what we said. If you purchased a Metaswitch, you probably went through some kind of evaluation process and came to the same conclusion. So part of me says, well, if you have a Metaswitch network today, why would you go to the trouble of replacing it with something you considered the first time?
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that. I think it comes back to this imaginary quote and the key question, which is the Metaswitch horse drowning, right? Which is effectively a question about risk, right? Is it so risky to stay on the Metaswitch horse that you should take a different risk and and a lot of expense and effort to switch to something else? And right now we don't exactly know what the future is. Maybe Microsoft continues to support Metaswitch in a reduced way for 5+ years. Maybe it gets acquired and the acquirer does something. There's some information we don't know. But regardless of that, I mean, our take after thinking about this a lot over the last 4, 5, 6 months is that the Metaswitch product is worth maintaining. In the telecoms industry, we've got plenty of clients who have only recently or are still in the process of migrating off DMS 100s or Lucent 5 ESSs. We have active projects doing this kind of thing, today. And these are products that were first, deployed in the early 80s, I want to say. So the telecoms industry has a long history of using switches for a long time. And, from our perspective, the products are worth continuing to use. They're good products. And we would like to help you to use them as long as you want to. So, we'll continue to provide support for service providers using Metaswitch, for as long as needed, really. Whatever happens, the product is good. It's a good product. And if it's better for you to keep using it, then we'll continue to help you to use it. And which really comes back to the North Star we were talking about earlier. We're here to serve your best interests. And if you like the product and it's in your interest to keep using it, then we'll help you do that. If you want to migrate to something different, we can help you do that too, right? It's really about giving you options and allowing you to do what you want. So looping it back to this question, I think the answer is that I don't think the Metaswitch horse is drowning. I think Microsoft, probably had some hopes that the horse would, sprout wings and fly off into the clouds. And that was their hope. And I don't think it has done that either. And this is my next ChatGPT effort, and I feel very pleased with this one. So this is Microsoft's vision. Like I said, I don't think that worked out, but just because this didn't happen doesn't mean that we don't have a very reliable horse that's quite capable of crossing the stream and continuing to run for a while. So thanks for letting me do these, Bob. I know you were skeptical of my my slides here.
Yeah, I think you've been spending a little bit too much time with Chat GPT, but I guess that leads us nicely to our next slide. If there aren't many options for local class 5 switching, should we just move class 5 into the cloud?
So this is a complex topic. Maybe is the answer, but also maybe not. Look, from a big picture, long-term point of view, sure, right? If you were designing our communications infrastructure from scratch, you'd put voice in the cloud, right? It's just another application running over your local, fiber network. Netflix is in the cloud, Zoom is in the cloud, emails in the cloud. Why is voice different? But of course, the truth is that's in theory. In reality, voice is different, right? If you're a regulated ILEC, you've got TDM circuits to your tandem, and oftentimes you can't, change them to SIP. You've got NECA regulations about keeping, calls within the LATA inside the LATA. You've got complex billing requirements, local number portability. Subscribers can choose their own carriers for different calls, and you've got to support that. Inter-carrier compensation. There's a whole bunch of stuff related to being a regulated ILEC that is pretty complicated. That's not to say it's impossible to move Class 5 voice into the cloud, and we do have a handful of clients who've done that, and we've helped them do it. But there are a lot of hoops to jump through, and sometimes you end up putting your subscribers in the cloud, but then also to comply with NECA, you end up putting equipment back in your central office, and you're kind of like half in the cloud, half not. So yeah, it's complicated. It's not impossible, but it is certainly complicated. Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just like when you made decisions the first time, just do your due diligence. Remember, migrations are hard, and what if you need to migrate off? Uh, another vendor or cloud provider. So do your due diligence. Is the cloud 5 nines? Is your connectivity to it 5 nines? Perhaps there should be a discussion around public cloud versus private cloud. Um, having spent a lot of time in this space, we talk about control and management. Every Metaswitch customer I've met always expressed their commitment and responsibility to their customers, their fabric of the community. That's their key differentiator. So, those things need to be considered. Understand migration processes and feature parity. Migrations are hard. And, when we first started doing the class 5 migrations, it was a heavy lift. Now you add, hosted PBX type services, it even gets harder. So go about it, do your due diligence, because when projects don't go well, it could introduce additional customer churn.
Yeah. And look, everyone, I know we've got a variety of people on this call, and it sounds a little bit like we're beating up on the cloud. And I want to emphasize, look, as a technologist, that's really not, my view. As a technical person, a cloud-based architecture makes a lot of sense, and it's definitely something, to aspire to, something where the industry is probably going to get to eventually. But also, I'm also a practical person, right? With the current regulations, it's surprisingly hard to migrate to the cloud in a compliant manner. So don't assume that that's something you have to do. That's really kind of what we're saying. And as we said earlier, if you're using a Metaswitch platform and it's working well and it's already paid for, then you should ask, is there a compelling reason to make a change? If it's cheaper and easier to stick with what works, then we're happy to continue being here to support you and help you use that as long as you want to use them. So really, that's the core kind of message here.
So some of these talking points, Andrew, focus a lot on ILECs and the regulations and traditional class 5 features. But when we talk about CLECs, competitive local exchange carriers, What about those who are selling those premium business services?
Yeah, I think the situation is different if you're in that world, and probably there's maybe two different types of companies here that are worth talking about. There's maybe CLECs, which are you're a CLEC, but maybe you're still doing kind of a lot of residential. It's more that your network isn't regulated. And then there's the scenario where you're actually in a high competition environment selling business communication services. So I think those are slightly different scenarios, but in both cases, I think you have more options than a regulated ILEC. So if you're a CLEC where your entire network is VoIP or could be VoIP, all your interconnections to the PSTN are a SIP, then my impression is, and I'm not a regulatory consultant, we're just kind of talking about what we hear in the industry, but my impression is that a lot of the regulations we've been talking about probably don't apply to you. So if you wanted to move your voice services into the cloud, then it's a lot simpler. And you've still got to, make the business case and look at it. But if there's a business case there, then yeah, it's going to be easier for you than it would be for an ILEC.
So basically, a VoIP only CLEC, we're going to still go through the same due diligence, but just less obstacles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way of putting it. But probably the more interesting scenario to think about is, if you're selling business services, and that's the scenario with the people who had the problems with Max UC that we talked about, and yeah.
Yeah. So this is a good talking point. What do you think about the Metaswitch UCaaS offering?
So I think the Metaswitch UCaaS offering, as it was prior to Max UC going away, I actually thought it was a good, well-rounded product. I'm sure some people liked other things better in different areas, but it was a decent product. It was a mature product. It had been around in the industry a long time, and I thought it was a pretty good product. The core issue was that, well, A, Max UC end of life happened, but B, that since the Microsoft acquisition, there really hadn't been any new feature development. And that's where, you really run into problems. If you're in an environment where, you're selling business services in your local market and there's not really a lot of competition and it's mostly small businesses that just want a handful of phone lines, then it probably doesn't really matter that much. Maybe Max UC wasn't important. Maybe, a roadmap isn't really that big a deal. But if your core business is selling UCaaS, then you're probably in a competitive environment. You're maybe competing against RingCentral, and the lack of roadmap becomes a huge issue there. So if you're in that scenario, then we'd strongly encourage you to find a cloud-based probably, or cloud-based is certainly an option, a UCaaS platform that has a great set of features and a strong roadmap, so that you can be competitive both today and into the future.
So would you look at that as a full migration? Would you look at it as a cap and grow? How would you approach that?
I think I would always start with cap and grow. I mean, you could migrate everything, but there's a couple of reasons why this is challenging. First off, actually, so from a revenue point of view, the Metaswitch is probably actually going to be cheaper than moving the lines to the new platform. Again, do your due diligence, but if you consider that the Metaswitch licenses were a one-time perpetual license and you've already paid for it, that's generally going to be cheaper than buying something new and maybe paying a monthly fee or whatever. So your CFO may well say, hey, leave lines on the Metaswitch if you can. But also just the effort involved in migrating is substantial. It's a lot of work. For UCaaS, you've got greetings to set up, hunt groups, IVRs, auto attendants, line sync monitoring, phones. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into doing a migration. So like I said, I think you should be getting a new platform, but the way I would do it is I would put new customers on the new platform, and then I would move old customers when they want it. So maybe their contract's up for renewal, maybe they are keen on new features, and then you move them. But if you've got somebody who's happy, then don't mess with them. Just leave them be. They're paying their bills. You don't want to cause work for you and work for them, which could even potentially result in them saying, hey, actually, now that you mention it, if I've got to do all this work on my voice platform, maybe I'll look at a competitor. So I think having the new platform is good, but doing a slow and steady, cap and grow plus slow migration is the way I would approach it personally.
So we talk about our support of our customers, and when they do want to move, we try to help them do that. Any plugs you can make with some of the people we've worked with, and how and people that our customers can look towards?
Sure. So we don't have like a single recommendation where we say you should all go to this platform. You know, largely because that's not our business. It would take a huge amount of work for us to like evaluate all the vendors in detail and figure out all the pros and cons, and even if we did, there probably wouldn't be a single solution that's best for everyone. But what we can tell you is some of the vendors that we've talked to, that some of our clients have worked with, and I can just throw some names out there for you to do some research on. And I'm pretty sure that some of these vendors are on this call. So hey guys, thanks for joining. So first off, a couple of primarily hosted options. So these are some people where they have a solution that's in the cloud and it's kind of on their infrastructure and you just kind of log into it. So probably the names we'd see most often in that space would be Alianza, and also Intermedia. And so yeah, we know people who work at both of those places, both good companies. And yeah, with Intermedia, if you did cloud contact center through Metaswitch, that was Intermedia's product, which used to be Telax, so you might be familiar with them. But so Alianza and Intermedia are hosted options. And then last week or 2 weeks ago, I went to the user conference for NetSapiens, which is a UCaaS platform that can be deployed in a hosted configuration, or you can deploy it locally. So you've got kind of more choices there. And then the last name I'd mention is UMA, or 2600 Hertz, which again has both local and cloud-based options. So like I said, we're not going to say this one is the best one, but these are some options you can consider. And we have good relationships with all of these folks. And if our clients want to work with them, we'll happily help you get those turned up. And we've done some projects along those lines with some of these vendors already. Okay, I think we're getting close to the time for Q&A. You'll be pleased to know I see some questions in the chat. So on this slide, I've just kind of summarized the key points of our discussion. We're going to do questions in just a minute, but I do want to throw up a poll first, if I can figure out where that is. Yes, I'm going to launch a poll, and this is really an opportunity for you to kind of, say who you are, but also if you would like to have a more personalized chat about this, if you'd like to have a conversation with Bob to kind of understand your situation and what makes sense for you, then there's going to be a question in the poll asking that. So I'm going to launch the poll now. So if there's 5 questions, a couple of which are optional. So if you could fill that out, then I think when you registered, we should have your email address, so hopefully we can tie it in. Obviously, if you're on the phone only, then yeah, you can't do this. But yeah, I'll give you just a couple of minutes to fill that out. And once we've got the good set of answers, then we'll move on to Q&A. This also gives me a chance to have some tea. Yeah.
Chat GPT music to play in the background?
No, although I did hear a fascinating.
Don't try to do it now, right?
No, I'm not going to try and do it now. Don't worry. I heard a fascinating story about some guy who'd figured out that basically he created a bajillion Spotify accounts, and he created a bunch of albums in Spotify using AI. And then he set all of his Spotify accounts on computers in the basement to run and play all of his music all day and all night, 24/7. And by doing this, he was able to earn more money than he was paying for the Spotify accounts. And so it was like, yeah, there was some kind of hack at the margins of using Spotify that he managed to do. So yeah, fun times. But no, AI generated music is not something I want to get into right now. I am enjoying the images though. All right, let me see. We've got some responses. Okay, Bob, some people want to talk to you. Most people don't, but some people want to talk to you.
Maybe some even remember. Yeah, that's great. I know, I tell you. So thank you all for filling that out if you are, because it keeps me from having to use my magnifying glass with all these business cards I've accumulated over 20 years. So you're doing me a favor.
Yeah, absolutely. We got to keep Bob busy. Got to make him earn his keep.
That's right.
All right, I'm going to leave that running for a minute, but I'm going to start on some of the questions. Let's see. So some of them we've answered already. So I'm going to say we've answered that. Yeah, someone was questioning exactly what Metaswitch has announced in terms of end of support. Yeah, there has been no date given for end of support, but they've made general announcements saying these products are going to or maybe they've just said end of sale. I'm not sure, but it's clear that they're heading towards an end of support announcement. So, like I said, there aren't specific dates apart from the hardware ones that pre-existed the layoffs. For the ATCA, I think that's around the end of 2029, beginning of 2030. So that's that. Okay, somebody asks, and I think we've partially covered this, but yeah, to reaffirm, someone says, what do you think of keeping residential subscribers on the Metaswitch platform and only migrating business subscribers? Is it too difficult to manage two platforms? Bob, do you want to take a go at that?
Well, the good news is the Metaswitch you already kind of know how to manage, so that's good. And then for those seldom used skills with the Metaswitch, you have a company like Award to pitch in and help and be your backstop. So taking on a point solution for certain services may make more sense, at least as an interim step. And so you can always reevaluate whenever you want.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, certainly having two platforms is harder than one, but you know, yeah, if you already know how to use one of the platforms, the effort involved in migrating is huge and not to be underestimated. So I think, that's probably much easier to have the two platforms than it is to do the migration.
And,
Yeah.
and I would also add again, as part of the due diligence, you always pay attention to your cost of service. And if everything's in alignment, and you're in good shape.
Yep. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh boy. I don't know if I have an answer to this. Someone's asking if there's any leads to investigate for people doing class 4 on the Metaswitch. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think probably I'd go back to my answer, which says, look, if your Metaswitch is working, don't mess with it. Like you're not going to see much innovation or need for new features in your class 4 network. So yeah, I would probably just keep running it if it's sitting there and if it's working. Unless Bob, do you know any good recommendations for class 4?
Well, only that before class 5 is class 4, which really is a little bit easier. From a technical point of view, it takes a little less care and feeding on a day-to-day basis. So I'm kind of your opinion. From a tandem point of view, I'd probably just chug along.
Yep, indeed. Someone's asking about the recording. Yeah, we have recorded this and we will make it available to everyone who registered. I think that's fine. It might take us a few days, but yeah, we do have the recording, so don't worry about that. Okay, someone's asking me to repeat the 4 vendor options we listed, so I can go back. Actually, I didn't put this on the slide, but the 4 vendor options were Alianza, Intermedia, NetSapiens, and UMA, where the first 2 are hosted options only, and the other 2 you can choose if you want it in your own network or to be hosted. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Is anyone considering getting out of the voice business altogether and focusing on core services such as internet and fiber? So this is an interesting one, actually, and I think this really gets down to kind of business strategy. I think it's important to think about who you are and what you are providing to your customers that makes kind of you special. What is the thing that you do well? And I think there are going to be some organizations that say, look, our core business is providing fiber, and we're going to do that. And yes, we want to provide voice, or we need to provide voice, but we're going to do it in as simple a way as possible. But then there are going to be other people who say, right, but what we are focused on is providing amazing customer service, and we only feel like we can do that if we own and control the more of the network, and so we have the ability to manage things ourselves. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I think it's important to think about, who are you? What are your organization's strengths? What do you do better than other people? And focus on that. Just in the same way as we were talking about for Award Consulting, focusing on our core purpose of providing those technical services. That's kind of how I would think about that question.
I might add that you worked hard to get those customers. So again, do your due diligence and see what's best for you. You have a lot of new entrants into the broadband space, right? So they get they build their fiber networks and they offer internet service, and they're looking for applications, workloads to put on those networks to get incremental revenue. So I wouldn't be too quick to necessarily go back to just internet and transport when you already have a revenue generating application. Again, it's got to make financial sense, but you've worked hard to get those customers, so make sure that it fits your mission with the company.
Yep. There's somebody here who's, I think, getting questions from management who wants to know what is a realistic timeline for migrating 12 to 15,000 hosted customers from the Metaswitch platform to a new vendor solution? And my answer is a long time. I mean, well, it depends a lot on how well you want to do it. I mean, we've heard some people talk about creating tools to kind of, click a button and migrate things. I don't think they're ever going to be fantastic. I mean, you hope they might be, but I would be, migrating hosted business customers is hard. Migrating residential lines is, relatively straightforward. And although even that, Metaswitch had a team of developers, writing scripts to kind of do that well. But for hosted customers with all the different variations on the phones and the buttons that they use on the phones and the way the services work and the greetings and all of that, it's a big and complex migration. I think that's really why we're saying, look, we'd advise you do a cap and grow and do the migration slowly. Yeah, maybe at some point there'll be a great tool where you can hit a button and it'll all migrate, but even then it's not going to be seamless. You're going to notice, the customers are going to notice there's going to be stuff that doesn't work. They're going to need extra support, that next day. I wouldn't be imagining that you're going to hit a button and 15,000 lines are going to get moved and nobody's going to notice. It's going to be, I would be doing it slowly, one business at a time to start with and providing them support when they run into things that don't work the way they're expecting.
Yep, I think you hit the nail on the head, Andrew. Just manage the expectations. You're going to change behavior. It's very, very hard to get pure feature parity, and that's fine as long as you're communicating to the customers, you're able to train them, and you have them prepared for what's next because you're presenting it as a value to them. So it just takes a lot of planning, coordination, but at the end, could be very good for them. So, but there is no easy button.
Yep. Okay. Do you see a viable option for small rural ILECs with 3,000 lines or less to consolidate voice services solutions? I'm not sure if that means kind of consolidating into multiple ILECs into one. What do you, Bob? How would you interpret that?
Well, only from what we are finding in the field, there are, very savvy, capable service providers that are, branching their wings to get into hosting. And why not? They have the skill set. They could be local in the region, and they may have relationships. They might be part of a consortium. So it's not unreasonable for service providers to become hosted providers. And that question might lead to that. And we're already seeing that type of activity as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that I think it's harder than people think. And I see a lot of people talk about it and then either not follow through or kind of try it and it doesn't really work. Just because, figuring out who's responsible for what, who has kind of ownership, how does the money side of things work, who's got admin privileges on the different systems to do different things and to troubleshoot things and to, there's a lot to think about. And yeah, we have seen a handful of people do it well, but I've also seen people kind of start down that path and then decide that it's not going to work for them. Or only one of the 10 potential customers says that they want to do it. So just make sure that you, again, as we've been saying, do your due diligence.
Yeah, and it goes back to that ILEC versus CLEC. There's a lot of regulatory, just the lattice in general, right, and having a gateway presence in those lattice. So yeah, you got to do that due diligence.
Yep. Let's see. How many CLECs are evaluating ditching their SS7 and TDM for an IntelliQuint/Peerless IPES solution, given they'll be leaving their Metaswitch behind anyway? I think that's probably a question for everyone listening, but I mean, certainly we know that Cinch, which is Intelliquent, does have in some areas some kind of solution where they can offer SIP trunking. I mean, that's really what it comes down to is, can you get SIP trunking from the tandem or from all the tandems you need to connect to? So some people certainly are looking at that, but it's not kind of super widespread. And of course, as we've been saying, we're not sure that leaving your Metaswitch behind anyway is necessarily the right thing to do.
I think TNS is also in that discussion too, right?
Yes, yeah. There's a few different people who've got, and some of these are kind of SIP trunkings to your switch, but some of them are like a hosted offering.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, we've kind of seen both. Um, okay. Sorry, just trying to get through all the questions here. Do we have any opinions on open source switching platforms like Camelio or SIPWise? Yeah, I mean, I think most of these are definitely kind of UCAS focused products. And actually, we'd mentioned 2600 Hertz or UMA earlier. 2600 Hertz, I think, is actually, or Kazoo is actually an open source platform, which then they've kind of productized around it. So, I think probably the trade-off you're going to have there is that it's obviously cheaper. That's what open source means. But there's no one standing behind it, and you might need to have pretty heavy engineering resources available to make sure that you're running it well. So it's going to be much less productized than a solution from a vendor that will stand behind their product.
I think that's the key, is just having the in-house expertise to manage that type of platform.
Yep, agreed. Wow, okay. We might have to, we're not going to get to everything here at this point. Okay, somebody's saying, with the suggestion to continue to chug along, keeping subscribers running on the Metaswitch platform, one fear is hardware failure. Do you foresee hardware component replacement to be an issue as time goes along, or do we expect that Microsoft will maintain a stock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So, yeah, this is a good question. So we've thought about this a lot and had a few conversations about this with our clients. So the best path is to eliminate this issue entirely by virtualizing your equipment and moving on to virtual machines or commodity servers before any kind of end of life happens. So in that scenario, then you're just running software, and it's up to you to kind of replace the hardware as you need new hardware for your VMs, but it's not really a big deal at that point. In terms of the 3510 or the ATCA hardware situation, what we found historically is that there is a used market for telecoms hardware, and with the 3510, 2510 stuff, as some people migrate off it, their hardware gets freed up, and then that becomes available on the gray market for people to use as spares. For the 2510, we actually ended up with some spares ourselves, but we also know of third parties. We do work with Relay Networks, for example, who kind of have a stock of various hardware, or they know people who have it. So typically, because some people will move and some people won't, the ones who stay on the hardware generally have enough available because there's other stuff in the market floating around, because some people have moved off it. And we obviously, have a role there because we are connected with a lot of people. And so we tend to know who's in different boats. So I wouldn't be worrying about that hugely. We're kind of looking at the future and trying to figure out what does the community need. And like I said, we've got third parties we work with. If we need to kind of maintain a little bit of stock for some of our clients, that's something we might consider. We're trying to kind of figure out that path, but it's not something that I would be hugely worrying about. Okay. Somebody says, has anyone been able to make a successful business case for partnering with Alianza or Intermedia? We got quotes from them, and there aren't a whole lot of margins. So yeah, I think it's going to vary for every different situation. I think the hosted platforms, some of them have different pricing models, depending, how it is. But certainly you want to be looking at that business case. I don't know if anyone, obviously some people have moved to these platforms, and so absolutely some people have made a successful business case. But you're right to look at it and say, okay, what are my costs today versus what would be my cost if I moved? I think in general, the business case made by a hosted platform is going to be to argue that you need to do less work because it's now in the cloud. I think there's a little bit of truth in that, but I don't think it's the case that you don't need to do any work once you move your product out of your central office. So yeah, it's definitely something you should be thinking hard about before making any decisions.
I think, Andrew, that points back to the business drivers again. So if you have a certain set of circumstances and business drivers, the return might just well be there. But if you're managing certain status quo and a static customer base, maybe not. So it just depends on what the business drivers are and how that relates to the return to use an alternative way or go to a cloud provider.
Yep. We're going to have to stop fairly soon. We're getting up to the end of the hour, but Jim asks, how do you do a cap and grow if there are end of support dates in April 2025 and 2026 for Max Meeting and Max UC? I think would be the answer there. Yeah, so you're right. Those dates are important, and then those dates. It's not like you can keep using it after those particular dates for Max Meeting and Max UC. So if you were to do a cap and grow on your hosted business and you use Max UC, then you would need to roll out a third-party product to provide that soft client on your Metaswitch. And you might say, well, if I'm going to do that, then I may as well just migrate. That's a valid point of view, but I think the effort involved in rolling out a third-party soft client is much, much less than the effort involved in doing a full migration. So I think people will make different options there, different choices, but those are kind of the things I would consider. And I think some people will do that. We'll go down both paths.
It might make sense if we can feel free to email us so that we can discuss that report.
Yep.
To them, might be helpful for them. Yep.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of last questions. With no absolute end of support dates announced, is it possible Microsoft will continue to support the Metaswitch software well after 2030? So it's certainly possible, and until an announcement is made, it's possible. I don't see the strategic logic for them to choose to do that. I don't think that, given the decisions they've made so far, I think choosing to continue to support Metaswitch for a very long time probably doesn't fit in line with the decisions they've made already. My hope is that they will, or even an acquirer might honor the 2030 kind of ATCA dates that have been out there. But until somebody says that, I don't think we can assume that that is the case. But yeah, I would be assuming that 2030 is probably the longest time that we'd be getting direct support from Microsoft. Okay, this is going to be the last one. Are there any licensing concerns post 2029 if nobody acquires Metaswitch? Will the Metaswitch stop working eventually? So I don't think so. It depends a little bit on what exactly you have, but many of the products have soft licensing in place, which means that it will work even beyond your licenses. It's just that you get a true up call, once a year from Metaswitch saying, hey, you use more capacity licenses, please pay your bill. I would assume that if Microsoft stops, doing anything with the product and lets go of the entire team, no one's going to be looking at those reports anymore. I think there were sometimes some kind of hard licensing on some products, maybe Perimeter, but there's been a recent effort to move people to local licensing versus cloud licensing. So I think the worst case scenario is maybe there's some capacity limits that you can't go beyond, in which case, you'd have to maybe supplement your platform with additional hardware or something like that. But I can't see a scenario where your product just stops working. You own it, you have the right to use it, you bought it, and you have the right to use it even if Microsoft, stops doing anything with Metaswitch. So yeah, I wouldn't be worrying too much about that. All right, I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We had a lot of them, but thank you all for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. There will be a recording. We do have the results of the poll, and we will follow up with you for those of you who asked for conversations or introductions. Thank you, Bob, for taking the time to chat with me today. And I've thrown up on the screen, if you're not already on our newsletter, you can sign up at awardconsulting.com/newsletter. You can contact us on our contact form. And just to finish, you thought I'd forgotten about the Hitchhiker's Guide stuff. I just want to repeat this. So long and thanks for all the fish. AI-generated ChatGPT image. But actually, I did a new one for today, given our flying unicorns thing. So this doesn't really work, but I enjoyed playing with ChatGPT. So thank you for indulging my sense of humor, and it's a pleasure talking to you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.